Hi there. Welcome to Lesson 8. As always, looking forward to discussing some great literature with you. Let me just give you an idea of where we're at in the course and where we're going with this particular lesson before I dive into the content. So, as always, I'll just real quickly remind you that our class is based around reading great literature and learning how to read great literature well, how to analyze it deeply, because that can help us answer some of the biggest questions that we've asked, that all humans ask. In the first half of the quarter, we focus more horizontally on relationships with other people. Here in the second half of the quarter, we're focusing on what I would call more vertical issues. You could use other words to describe them, metaphysical issues, spiritual issues, you could say. And so in Lesson 6, we tackled the problem of evil. And then in Lesson 7, last time, we launched a little mini unit where we take on the metaphysical, spiritual issue of the afterlife. And so part 1 of that was, how would we get there if there is some kind of, hypothetically speaking, greater afterlife? So how do we get there was Lesson 7. Here, Lesson 8, we're going to deal with, really, to put it simply and bluntly, the question of God, which I think is a question we all ask at some point. Does God exist? If so, what of him? What is he like? Does he care about me? Those kinds of sub-questions very naturally go along with this larger question. And to frame the question in a different way to see how it fits into our discussion, if we're doing a mini unit on the afterlife, in part 1 or Lesson 7 was how do we get there? Part 2, this lesson would be, who oversees it? Who's in control of the universe? Part 3, and our final lesson for the quarter, which will be Lesson 9 for our class, we'll do with a third question dealing with the afterlife next time, which is, what is that place like if it exists? What are some possible options that literature can help us sort through? So, one of my goals for this lesson, obviously, then, is to discuss some great literature with you, and in doing that, to get at this question of, does someone greater than ourselves, greater than human beings exist? But there's also a second objective, which we'll actually tackle in the first part of this lesson, which is to introduce you to short lyric poetry again. 2 lessons ago, we looked at some short lyric poetry by William Blake, and I gave you an introduction to how to read short lyric poetry because it's so different than reading prose, fiction, and we've mainly read fiction this quarter. I have used the theme of narrative as kind of a way to guide our discussions, the idea that narrative helps us answer these big questions. I think narrative or fiction is one of the most accessible genres of great literature, but poetry can, in many cases, equally be helpful. And since this is an introduction to literature course, I'd be doing you a disservice if we didn't go over short lyric poetry in addition to the great fictions and narratives we're also reading. So, this is our second and final foray into short lyric poetry. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you do it a third time. And we're going to go a little bit deeper. Last time, we just went over how to read it, basically, some tips, some strategies for reading it. So we're going to go a little bit deeper. And remember, I said that one of the reasons why we have to have these special strategies we talked about in Lesson 6 for reading it is that poetry is almost like another language. And so when you're reading it, you're really translating it. And so you have to read it a few times, take even more notes in the margins than usual, read it out loud, etc. Today, we're going to work on deciphering that language a little bit more. I'm going to function, you could say, as kind of an interpreter for you. So I've given you a short one-page kind of web page to read in addition to the literature, which is poetry terms. And so these are the devices, you could say, these special, unique aspects of language, poetical devices or poetical uses of language that you don't usually see in fiction or in regular speech. And so we'll figure out what some of these terms are, how they function in poetry, and practice them, really, is what we're going to do. So we're going to look at, in this lecture, we're going to look at one poet in particular who's one of my personal favorites. His name is Rainer Maria Rilke. So we'll start with a little bit of background on him, and then we'll look at the poetry terms. I think there's 30 or 40 of them on that article I gave you. They're only like one sentence descriptions, and there's really good examples for a lot of them. I'm going to go over, I think, about 8 or 9 of the most common, most important ones in the lecture. We'll review the tips for reading short poetry, and then I will model an analysis for you of 2 of Rilke's poems, and I'll identify some of the poetic devices he uses from our poetry terms reading. And so you can see in action how an analysis of actually 2 poems uses these terms to help convey the points I'm making in the analysis. But then our discussion board will be very different. I've uploaded a folder on Canvas that has, I think, 10 or 12, a good number of short lyric poems by well-known poets. And so rather than giving you a set of discussion board questions, you can choose any poem you want from that folder. It's on Canvas under Files, and it's labeled Lyric Poetry. And it basically do what I did in this lesson. Write a summary of what the poem is. Answer the question, what do you think its meaning or message is, and why is that message significant or important? And when you're doing your write-up of the poem, use at least 2 or more of these terms from the poetry terms in your write-up to explain what's happening in the poem. So as I mentioned, one of my all-time favorite poets, his name is Rainer Maria Rilke. I'm just choosing one of my personal favorites since I'm kind of demoing for you what I'm asking you to do. And I've given you a wide variety of things to choose from, when you go to actually do your work on your end of things. And both poems by Rilke deal with depictions of animals. The first one is called The Panther, as we have here, and then The Swan. And both of these animal poems, latch on to kind of specific qualities of the specific animals, the panther and the swan, and then build on that and give us really in-depth explorations of larger, more spiritual, more metaphysical concepts through the description of this animal. And that's often the power and the ability of short lyric poetry, and why I think it's important to study it. Earlier in the quarter when we read the Iliad, we actually saw what I would call narrative poetry that tells a story. Short lyric poetry, I keep saying the word short. I probably don't have to say that. It's kind of assumed. Lyric poetry is short because it doesn't tell a story, it describes something. So we're not reading a story of what the panther does or what the swan does. We're reading a description of just some actions of these animals, and that's very brief, but that brief description, kind of you could say the poetical exploration of it in 14 or 16 lines, very brief, is like a conduit to these greater poetical, subliminal kind of experiences. And so we go much deeper through this short description. And I'm hoping with the Panther and the Swan, I can show you the power of these poems. And that's how they fit into our larger discussion, our question today of does something greater than ourselves exist? I'm using a strategy here, which is maybe a little unorthodox, but by looking at something we typically assume to be lower than ourselves, animals, I'm seeing if we can use our study of something we usually assume to be lower than us to get at, to understand something greater than us, which seems like kind of an ironic approach to teaching. But we live in a created world full of all kinds of non-human things. And this question of is something greater than us, a sub-question of that is if there is something greater than us, did he or she or it, whatever it is, create this created world in which we live? And the animals can actually tell us a lot about that. So by going lower, we can stretch ourselves higher. By going lower, we can stretch ourselves higher. That should be, you could say, the theme for this particular lesson. And you'll see that in Rilke's poems when we look at as animals. And you'll see it even more in part 2 of this lecture when we look at a very long story that also heavily features a very important animal. We'll start by going over some of these poetry terms from the reading on Canvas, then look at Rilke's background, and the tips for reading short lyric poetry, and finish with the actual analysis of the poems, of course. So I would recommend you really read that document. It will be so helpful to you for your further studies of lyric poetry. And there's a lot of terms on there that are pretty crucial to reading and interpreting lyric poetry that I'm not going to cover in this lecture for the sake of time. I mean, how bored would you be if I covered all 40 of them? But these, I think I've picked about 9 here I'm going to go over on this slide, are some of just the most commonly used, most important ones, though the others are very frequently used and important as well. And I'd love to see you use some of these in the analysis you do on Canvas, or ones I haven't included here, so that it can help prep you for just further potential studies in lyric poetry. Alliteration. You've probably heard this one before. It's the repetition of identical sounds at the beginning of words. So it's, in advertising all the time, because if you have two words that basically begin with the same letter or the same sound, it sticks in your mind. An allusion is essentially like a reference, but it's unacknowledged. So the poet is assuming something about their audience, some kind of prior knowledge they have. They'll just get this reference without any kind of mention of what the reference is. An end-stop line. A line ending in a full pause, usually indicated with a period or a semicolon or some other punctuation mark that makes the reader stop. So this is really, really crucial. More crucial than it sounds just from reading that short description. When you look at the lyric poetry reading tips, you'll see. So in my tips for reading lyric poetry, one of them is reading it out loud. And this is the reason why, is punctuation becomes very important in lyric poetry, because rhythm and timing is very important. So if you have something like a period or a semicolon, that's punctuation. That's the end of a sentence, right? So when you're reading that signals to the reader a pause, a longer, fuller pause than a comma. And if it's an end-stop line, that means it's at the end of the line of poetry, because a lot of times you'll have multiple lines before there's punctuation, and they'll just keep going, maybe 3, 4 more lines with no punctuation. So you just keep kind of reading at normal speed. Then the poet throws in a period or a semicolon, then you stop. Sometimes it'll even happen in the middle of a line. Sometimes it'll be at the end of a line. And so an end-stop line is a line where it is at the end of a line. And the poet, the author, will be very strategic about when they want you to stop. That punctuation is important to how they do that. Enjambment is a line having no end punctuation but running over to the next line, which is what I just mentioned, where you have like 2, 3, or 4 more lines, without punctuation. And sometimes enjambment will be oftentimes the period, the semicolon in the middle of a line. So you stop there. Again, for an intentional reason on the poet's part, they want you to feel or experience something with the pacing at which you read it. And our minds are trained to stop when there's punctuation, but when we're reading inside our heads, we tend to just kind of move at the same pace no matter what. Reading out loud, we tend to observe the rules of punctuation more so, and that's why reading out loud is so crucial. Hyperbole is overstatement, and litotes is understatement. You see hyperbole more often, but this is like saying something like, my head exploded or my face melted. It didn't actually happen, but what did was so thrilling or exciting or amazing, you use the overstatement to convey that. You can use hyperbole in all different ways. That's just one example. A metaphor is a comparison between two unlike things. So it's saying this literally is something. It's a sauna in here, just to describe that a room is hot, even though it's not literally a sauna. But you say that it is. This is probably one of the most, or maybe the most commonly used poetical devices. It's so common. Poets are always making these kinds of comparisons. Onomatopoeia is a sound where the word sounds like its name. So crash or smash, that kind of a thing. A paradox. I know we've talked about paradoxes in this class. They're so important to literature in general, but it's a contradiction that is nonetheless true. As I've explained it before, having two things together in a text, both present, that are opposites, but they're not in conflict. They somehow work together beautifully. Finally, personification, which Rilke uses quite frequently in his poems, is attributing human characteristics to non-human things or abstractions. So some of the animals that we'll see in the panther and the swan, he attributes certain characteristics to them that we usually observe or see in humans. And Rilke takes personification, you could say, to a whole other level. So we'll talk about that more in the Rilke portion of the lecture. As I've said, these are just some of the most common ones. Please review the whole document and use these or others in the poetry analysis you do for the discussion board. I will say some of these can appear in other places. Things like paradox, metaphor, hyperbole, personification, maybe even those certainly show up in fiction too, just more often in poetry. Some of them, like in stop line and enjambment, you only really see in poetry. And then others like alliteration, onomatopoeia, personification, allusion, those could be in both. They're just much more common in poetry because they have to do with language and hearing things. You don't really read novels out loud very often, but people frequently recite poetry out loud. Hey, so a little bit about Rilke himself, since he's the poet we're studying for my demonstration of using these terms in analysis. He had a difficult childhood because he had an older sister who had died at a very young age, and that was incredibly traumatic to his mother. And so she, to kind of, you could say, I guess, cope with the loss of her daughter, she dressed him as a girl, and that just obviously was confusing to him. And it's after the lecture on Sonny's Blues and what the narrator and his wife Isabella experienced with the death of their daughter Grace. Hopefully we can all, see here how we're getting a bit of a window into some family trauma that clearly, for a variety of reasons and in a variety of ways, influenced Rilke throughout his life and shaped his life. He had a number of different occupations early in his adult life before settling into a career as a poet. Went to military academy, business school, worked at a law firm, and also at the University of Prague. None of those were really great fits for him. His literary career began when he published 2 books of poetry in between his work and studies. So time at the University of Prague, some of these various jobs, he was able to, in between those things, work on some books of poetry and finally got 2 books of poetry published. That's when his literary career took off. His personal relationships: in 1897, he fell in love with the married psychoanalyst Lou Andreas Salome. And so they weren't able to have a relationship in the traditional sense, since she was already married, but she was they corresponded and whatnot. She was a lifelong influence on his poetry. And she was a psychoanalyst, which was interesting. Rilke was writing at the beginning of the 20th century, when right around the time Freud was first writing in psychoanalysis was being born as a field of studies. He got to go to Russia in 1899, where he met Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist of the 19th century, who was a huge influence. And so he was swayed and influenced by Russian mysticism. Just seeing the landscape there, it's such a breathtaking, dramatic countryside to see that was really influential. And those first couple of volumes of poems, that was his first success. He wrote the first one while in Russia there. His wife, he married Clara Westhoff, and they were artists, part of kind of an artist colony, living in the area of Wapswede, Germany, but it didn't last long. They soon separated. After that, so he's kind of lived all over the world. He was like one of the first artists or writers we think of as like a cosmopolitan. So Russia, and then Germany, and then next Paris. And in Paris, he met another writer named Auguste Rodin, and they became good friends. And Rodin was very influential on Rilke, just helped Rilke master his craft. And so really the more kind of technical elements of writing poetry, which is what he didn't have pinned down yet, even though he'd had some early success. And so after this friendship with Rodin, he wrote a collection called New Poems, which is probably one of his most successful volumes. That's where the poems we're studying today came from. And so he dedicated that volume to Rodin. In 1911, he stayed at Duno Castle when he was the patron of Princess Marie von Thurn. This was an incredibly influential experience. He wrote a set of poems called the Duno Elegies while he was there, and those are considered like his crowning achievement. They're longer and more complex than the poems we're studying in this lecture, but they're well worth your time to read if you're interested in poetry. One of my highest recommends. And this was near the end of his life. He served in World War I, but was discharged in 1916. So he'd begun the Duno Elegies at Duno Castle a few years before the war. He left to serve in the war, then it was discharged, I think, due to injury. And after the war, he was able to finish the elegies. And so there's really, if you read the Duno Elegies, you can really see the trauma of World War I, especially with him beginning the elegies before the war, finishing them after his discharge. You see kind of the transition. That is really the mark of the changes of the modern world and how World War I embolized our transition as a world society from kind of a pre-modern period to a modern period. World War I shattered our innocence. The Duno Elegies captures that beautifully. He also had a long collection of sonnets, the sonnets to Orpheus. Those two are considered his two greatest works. Both began just before the war, finished after, and then he died shortly after this. So what are the main threads we're going to pull on as we study his poems here? He considered art an essentially religious activity. He was not religious in what we would call the traditional senses, and he was not, say, a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or something, but his poems are very spiritual, and so he considered art a religious activity. He was seeking a comprehensive vision of cosmic unity. That sounds like this big, weighty thing, and it is, but what he really means here is that since he wasn't religious in the traditional sense, he was seeking, you could say, a religious kind of an answer through his poetry and his art. And so, cosmic unity, who is God, what is the universe? He's trying to answer those questions through his art and his poetry. He was haunted by the incompleteness of human experience and the passage of time. This is a statement I read about him in a biography I was reading once of him, and I think it really describes him well. Like I talked about his experiences in World War I, and just seeing the pain, suffering, trauma he saw in his lifetime, living in some difficult years from the end of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century. He was haunted by the passage of time, the toll it takes, and moreover, the incompleteness of human experience. So you connect these 3 points together, 1, 2, and 3 here, you see a clear connection. That he wasn't religious in a traditional sense, but he sought religion or spirituality through his artistic vision and tried to answer the big questions. And in that process, he saw the incompleteness of human experience. So even though he had rejected traditional forms of religion, he knew that the human experience wasn't the end-all be-all. There had to be something more. He didn't quite decide on what, but I think he came close in his kind of secular spiritual explorations here. For the next thread, point 4, I've divvied it up over several bullet points because it's a complex working out of what is, you could say, the common kind of trope of his art, the common thematic strand of his art. So I'm going to break that up for you into several points, and it all relates to these first 3 points and his vision, his goal. So he called his poems thing poems, which is a translation from a German word I'm not going to strive to pronounce for you right now, which is physical reality, absolute otherness, and thing-like nature. So by looking at something like a panther or a swan, that is very other, absolute otherness from the human form. That's a physical thing. It exists in physical reality, so it has a thing-like nature. But there's a spiritual element going on to connect to the 3 previous points here. So the physical reality is like a conduit to something greater. And that's the importance of the thing-like nature of things. Essentially, you could say in another way, looking at the created world, the physical reality, and seeing how that leads to other things. He was really into ancient artifacts. One of the poems that's in the folder, but I'm not going over in this lecture, is Archaic Torso of Apollo, where he sees the torso of the statue of Apollo from I think ancient Rome or Greece, and writes a poem about it. And so when he looked at objects, because he didn't just look at animals, although I'm doing the lecture on the animal poems, when he looked at objects like the torso of Apollo, he saw it as this thing from the past, but detached from that. So because of this thing-like nature, in and for itself, this thing has an essence or a being, and having the poetic spiritual moment with that, leads to a conduit to greater things. These things are alive with a strange vitality when under the poet's gaze. So in terms of how these created things lead to something greater, that process happens when the poet looks at it, starts writing about it. So a physical presence that transcends words challenges the viewer on an existential level. I think here we have what is beautiful about lyric poetry, and why I wanted to use Rilke for this lesson is the poet looks at the panther or the swan or the statue or something, and there's an experience there where the poet tries to put it into words and does the best they can, but it transcends that. That's why it's a spiritual or metaphysical experience, and the words can't possibly do it justice, but the words can be kind of a conduit or a path. Through reading the words, through reading them out loud, through really engaging with the poetry, we can get a glimpse of what the poet experienced in that moment when they composed the poem and have our own transcendent, potentially, experience. So the scope of these objects shames the observer's puny existence. So just like I mentioned before, Rilke saw the incompleteness of human experience and the tragedy and suffering of the world around him. And so when you see the panther or the swan, there's this immensity of this thing that it really makes the viewer feel small, which Rilke is arguing is a good thing. It's good to see that there are things that are transcendent and greater than us, because he saw the failing of human beings, how we are not perfect creatures. And so Rilke got to the point where he didn't say there is God, I believe in God, but he got to the point where he said there is something greater than the human being and human experience and suffering, because he saw the incompleteness of that, because he saw suffering, but he also saw the things, the panther, the swan, that point to. They themselves are not greater, but they point to something greater. Something lower than humanity can point to something greater than humanity. And with this kind of transcendent experience with the animals, you have essentially personification, right? Ascribing human characteristics to non-human things, but it goes even beyond personification, because it's not just human qualities he's ascribing to these animals, it's something even greater. So finally, Rilke infuses objects or animals with ideas, emotions, and values. So an even higher form of personification than you usually see in poetry. That's what makes his poetry incredibly unique, and why I wanted to study it for this lesson. So the tips for reading short lyric poetry. It's different from reading the long epic poetry we've read, especially because what we read was in translation, so we lost some of the poetic language of it. Those kinds of things read more like a novel. This is poetry in the true sense of poetry, what probably comes to your mind when you think of poetry, more so than a long epic with a story. And probably why I would hazard to guess you've not necessarily been a fan of poetry up to this point. My goal is to convert you to being a fan of poetry, because I myself was not a fan as undergrad, had to learn to read it to be able to succeed in graduate school, and now have a great appreciation for it. So what I'll say with poetry is this: the juice is worth the squeeze, but the squeeze is quite a challenge. So poetry takes time. You may have a really short poem. Rilke's The Panther is only 12 lines. If you just sit and read The Panther at the pace you read anything else, you'll be done in less than a minute. But what I'm asking you to do here is take a poem like The Panther and take like maybe 20 or 30 minutes with it. I know that sounds like a lot, but if you do that squeeze, the juice you get out of it will be worth it. Trust me. So here's what you do at that time. Read the poem once at a normal pace to just get a feel for it. The most basic level, just get a feel for it. Then read it again, but out loud and slowly to get a feel for the rhythm. So that first read through would be very fast, just normal pace. That'll give you kind of the language, the sound of it, because sound, language, rhythm are important. The rhythm, the pacing, will then come through in a second read if you do it out loud. Going back to what I said about enjambment, if you see where the punctuation is, if you pause, if you do brief pauses where there are commas, and you do long pauses when there are periods and semicolons, and you read it slowly out loud, you'll get more of a feel for it, really get a feel for the rhythm and pacing. And so these two reads will give you a good feel for the poem. But like I said, because of the poetical devices, poetry is almost like another language. So on your third read through, try to paraphrase in your own words what each line of the poem means by making notes in the margins. So write in the margin next to the poem. If you have it printed out, you can jot down what the line means. Just go line by line, treating it like another language, because it almost is, and translating it because it technically is English but feels like another language. You can do yourself can do the translation, and all the training you need for that is what we're doing in this lesson. So you take a short poem like The Panther. After those first two reads, go through it again and go line by line in your own words. Then read your paraphrase of the poem, right? It in your own words, 12 lines, 16 lines, however long it is. Finally, after you've done all of this, so you've got like at least 4 reads here, read it one last time out loud slowly again, but after you've done all of these first 4 steps. And if you on the first step had no idea what the meaning of the poem is, my guess is after the 5th time reading it, after you've done all these steps, you will. And you've probably spent, at least 20, 30 minutes here if it's a 12-line poem, which is really short poem. But like I said, you're going to get a lot out of it. The juice will be worth the squeeze. Since you've gone line by line up to this point, what you now want to do is get the thing as a whole, its completeness. So try to sum up the poem and the entire poem in just a few sentences to get a sense of its unity. So in other words, if you've got a 12-line poem and you've paraphrased each line, now take just 1 or 2 sentences. And what does this mean? If someone says, tell me what The Panther's about, and you've got 1 sentence, do that. Then you'll have a very cohesive understanding of the poem. Finally, as they always recommend in this class, the so what factor. Answer the question, because now you know what the meaning of the poem is. Answer the question, what is significant or meaningful about the message of the poem? If you do this, you'll begin to experience poetry in a new way. And I think you'll really like it. All right, so now I'm going to attempt this with the panther and then with the swan. So I'm gonna, with like the panther is 3 short 4-line stanzas. So I'm gonna go a stanza at a time, and I'll read the stanza slowly out loud, kind of that step 2, and then I'll give kind of like a summary of what I think is happening in that stanza, and ideally what I describe as happening in that stanza will connect back to our threads. So here's the panther. His vision from the constantly passing bars is grown so weary that it holds no more. To him it seems there are 1,000 bars, and behind 1,000 bars no world. So hopefully you heard rather, how I read that. For instance, his vision, pause, from the constantly passing bars is grown so weary that it holds no more. Longer pause. So he wants you to pause at the beginning so that you get the phrase, his vision. Then I didn't really stop between the 2 lines, but at the end of the second line, I paused for even longer than I did after reading his vision, because it was a period. And so Rilke clearly wants you to have like these 2 statements here, since you have a period of the second line and a period of the fourth line. What's going on though? So this is clearly a thing poem with an object personified. Because the panther is experiencing imprisonment, right? It's caged up in a zoo, like that picture I showed you at the beginning of the lesson. And it's almost as a human would. He has grown so weary that his vision holds no more. He's no longer taking in things. And it seems there are 1,000 bars, and behind 1,000 bars, no world. So I could say, if I just didn't tell you the name of the poem and just handed these 4 lines to you and said, what is he describing? And you would say, a person in prison. A person in prison, but it's the panther. And if you look at the little footnote, you'll see that Rilke wrote this after he saw an actual panther at a zoo in Paris. So it's personification here. And why? He wants us to sympathize with the panther in a way we might not if he were describing it, in a non-human kind of a way. But he's describing the imprisonment in a human kind of way, so we sympathize with the panther. One quick note, I'm using a slightly different translation here than the ones I gave you on Canvas. That's because I've taught this poem a number of times, and I'm recording a brand new lecture to fit our class specifically, but I've used this particular slide multiple times before, and I didn't update the translation to the ones I gave you, but that's okay. I think it's actually good, because you'll see how the spirit, the essence, the meaning of the poems is pretty much identical, but there's little slight differences. And so it'll give you an insight into translation, since we've read a few things in different translations in this course. Okay, second stanza. The padding gait of flexibly strong strides that in the very smallest circle turns is like a dance of strength around a center in which stupefied a great will stands. So here, Rilke wants you to get the padding gait of flexibly strong strides that in the very smallest circle turns. He wants those 2 phrases. There's a pause with each of those 2 phrases. He wants you to really take in those 2 phrases and what each of them means. And then he gives you the big idea. It's like a dance of strength around a center in which stupefied a great will stands. So to go back to our threads, the physical presence of the panther challenges us existentially. What is that challenge? Well, Rilke couples the immense power, strength, speed, and intensity of the panther with his imprisoned, stupefied nature to show us the tragic horror and suffering of his captivity. So if in the first stanza what Rilke was doing was personifying the panther's imprisonment to help us sympathize with the panther, he now, here in the first two lines, addresses very panther-like qualities. In the first two lines here, the panther is not seen human because he's got flexibly strong strides. So think of this powerful jungle cat that can, run faster than a car, but he's in the very smallest of circles, so he's pacing in a small circle. Is like a dance of strength around a center. So you've got the uniqueness of the panther in lines 5 and 7 here. And then in lines 6 and 8, you have this great strength is in a prison. The very smallest of circles in which stupefied a great will stands. So this amazing creature, a creature that shames us because it's a powerful creature, unlike any human being, is trapped in a way that stupefies that great nature. And so we see the horror, the suffering of the panther there. And then that causes us to ask all kinds of questions, right? I mean, on the one level, at a kind of most basic surface level, there is the most basic level, there's this animal rights kind of thing that's important, right? Some of the things zoos do are not good, but on a deeper level, it's existential question about, a great will, great abilities, being limited, being caged, being trapped. This can ask us greater questions about ourselves, cause us to ask greater questions about ourselves in the universe. Final stanza. Only sometimes the curtain of the pupil soundlessly parts, then an image enters, goes through the tension stillness of the limbs, and then the heart ceases to beat. So here Rilke takes us inside the mind of the panther, kind of connects back to the first stanza of where we taken an image, its eye is taken an image, goes into its body, its soul, where normally the mind would process it and say, this is what this is, but rather than having any kind of revelation or realization or epiphany from seeing an image, it just reaches the heart and dies because the painter's great will is trapped behind these bars. And so you've got the psychology of the panther. This is an extreme degree of personification here. But again, it shows us so much. Like, do you ever feel like you're trapped walking in circles, that you could be made for something greater? And how does that affect your mind as you process things like what you see? So Rilke's poems really challenge us to think and show us how small our existence is in relation to the universe, the larger world, through these powerful things like panthers and like swans. So here's the swan. This toiling to go through something yet undone, heavily and as though in bonds, is like the ungainly gait of the swan. Personification again. Here, the swan's slow gait resembles the struggles of humans. So with the panther, you had a specific kind of imprisonment situation, and we could read that as a metaphor for aspects of the human existence, maybe COVID-19, isolation. Here, though, it's just kind of the daily struggle, this toiling to go through something yet undone, heavily as though in bonds. So if you've seen the way a swan walks on land, it's very awkward. The human experience is difficult, it's challenging, it's full of suffering. So the ungainly gait of the swan represents that. Now, there's two stanzas here, and the second one is very short. So I'm just going to read the rest of the poem and get to do the meaning of it on the slide after that. In dying, is no longer grasping of that ground on which we daily stand, like his anxious letting himself down into the waters which receive him smoothly, and which, as though happy and bygone, draw back underneath him, flow on flow, while he, infinitely still and sure, ever more maturely and more royally, and more serenely deigns to draw along. lot of stuff going on here. I've got some points on the final slide, but I want to, before we go to that, where the words are still on the screen, I want to point out a couple of things. So a swan is a really interesting subject for a poem because it can walk on land or water and it can fly, but its walking on land is ungainly. I would go so far as to say, kind of extend the ungainliness or the awkwardness a step further and say unnatural. Its movement seems so much more natural when it's on water. And he says, in dying, this no longer grasping of that ground on which we daily stand, like is anxious letting himself down. Now that could sound like a reference to like death being freeing, but I don't think it means a literal death of the physical body, because the swan isn't dying. It's stepping off of the land onto the water. So that's what we get. The first two lines there, lines 4 and 5, set us up for the description of what the swan does when it steps onto the water in line 6. And so I think the dying, if we take the dying and combine it with the last 6 lines there, lines 7 through 12, what we get is not a dying of the physical body, but a dying to self, a letting oneself down. What does that mean? I'll get into it. So into the waters, he moves much more smoothly. Again, right, it's a more natural thing, and the waters draw back underneath him, flow on flow, while he moves even more maturely and royally, and then here, most importantly, and more serenely, deigns to draw along. That phrase means deigns is kind of, again, letting oneself down, thinking less of oneself. I believe the translation you have I actually like better is condescends to glide. So the gliding is beautiful. It's natural and beautiful compared to the gainly, awkward walking from line 3, but it's a condescension, condescends to glide. It's becoming lower. So remember I said the idea with this focus on the poems here is these poems about animals is to, and we're talking about human existence, this kind of metaphysical existential crisis, then it's looking at something lower, animals, to get to something higher, spiritual or metaphysical experience. So I think what this poem is ultimately about is humility, dying to ourselves, letting ourselves down, leaving this earth, not necessarily dying, but going to a higher spiritual or metaphysical state, becoming lower to become greater. I think that's only possible through humility, and that's what this poem is about. To kind of sum up what I just said, I wanted to say it with the words on the screen, but now to like recap for you so it's concrete in your mind. Wilke describes human emotions, such as anxiety and happiness, the animals and objects of the poem. The swan in the water. Swan's awkward movements on land allude to, so an allusion here, they reference something but without mentioning it directly. One of our poetry terms, they allude to the struggles of everyday human existence. So he doesn't say the swan is like a human, but that reference with the ungainly gait, the personification, that's an allusion, makes us think of everyday human struggles or toils. Only when the swan leaves the earth, leaves the ground, and onto the water does his journey become more smooth. But the swan is on water rather than in the air, so his transition off the earth is a condescension, a going lower of sorts. So to respond to the struggles of human life, we must leave the earthly plane for a more spiritual realm, but do so by making ourselves low. So the only way to get to something higher, a higher state of existence, is to become lower. You translate that, the metaphors, the allusions, to see how it's relevant to human experience. How do we get higher by making ourselves low? Humility. So there you have my interpretations of the Panther and the Swan, using the lyric reading poetry tips by going line by line, stanza by stanza, reading out loud slowly for the rhythm and pacing. And that eventually gets us to the meaning. So I could go the swan line by line, and I kind of did that out loud for you. But now I could sum it up in one word: humility. And I think the meaning of why that's important is obvious. It teaches us a lesson about how to achieve a greater existence. So there you have it. Now, I'd love to see you do the same thing with any of the poems from that folder on Canvas that I've marked as lyric poetry under files on Canvas. So choose one of those short lyric poems from the folder lyric poems under files, or because I didn't have a PDF of it, one of my favorite poems by Shakespeare, Sigh No More, Ladies, Sigh No More, and that's right here on Module 8 since I couldn't put it in a folder. Spend some time closely reading the poem using the tips for reading short lyric poetry. Then in your discussion board post, sum up the poem in just a few sentences. Use 2 or more terms, as many as you want, but at least 2, from the Poetry Terms webpage when summarizing the poem. Conclude your post by answering these 2 questions. What is the main meaning, or what is the main message or meaning of the poem, and what is significant or important about the poem's message or meaning? So if you do all that, it should get you right around the 250 words you usually need for a discussion board post. And so the first few sentences can be a summary. This is what the poem says. Then you get at what is the meaning or message of it. Finally, the so what factor, why does that matter? And when you're summarizing it, or really at any point, try to use some of the terms from the Poetry Terms webpage, because that will get you ready, prepare you to do more lyric poetry analysis as you go on in other classes beyond this. So I'm really looking forward to see what you do with lyric poetry, especially since there's so many choices. I hope if you didn't love poetry before this lesson, you might afterwards, but as a recovering non-lover of poetry, I know how hard that transition from not loving poetry to loving poetry is. But hopefully this experience helps. I can't wait to read your discussion board posts.